welcome to a special festive edition of Reasoned Heretic. I hope you all had a absolutely wonderful Christmas with your families and friends and loved ones. So today, rather than addressing another serious topic, as I've done previously, I thought for a change I should make something a bit more festive and fun and uplifting. I know I haven't produced a video for a few weeks now, and that's because I've been away traveling on a road trip in Central Europe, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So over 8 days in total, I managed to visit a total of no less than 4 European capital cities: Budapest, Vienna, Prague, and Bratislava. So respectively capitals of Hungary, Austria, Czechia, and Slovakia. And I also visited Salzburg in Austria, Hallstatt in Austria, and Český Krumlov in Czechia. Generally, all of these cities I found to be less woke than London, and unapologetic in their upholding of traditions, and particularly Christmas traditions and heritage. I found all of the city centres to be beautifully decorated, clean and tidy, and with the exception of Vienna and parts of Prague, which were both overrun with tourists. Vienna was absolutely overrun with tourists. I found all these places to be actually quite spacious and relatively low density, but that might be a low bar when you live in London. Very beautifully, as I say, decorated with Christmas lights. In Budapest, even some of the trams were lit up festively. Budapest was architecturally fascinating. It's where I flew to, where I started off on my tour. Hungarian Parliament is, in my view, the only parliament in the world more magnificent than our own British Parliament. And that's only perhaps because inspired by our own British Parliament, Augustus Pugin Spires. In many respects, the Budapest Parliament bears resemblance to the British Parliament. Both were located on the banks of the Thames in London, in our case, and the Danube in Budapest. Both were Gothic revivalists as well, and both symmetrically in terms of their layout, fan out from a central hall and accommodate bicameral debating chambers. So there are a lot of similarities, but Budapest Parliament is fair to say even more ornate than the British Parliament, and it has not only one but 2 domes arched over its central hall. It has the grandest of grand staircases, and I would say it probably almost certainly bears several hundred tons more gold than ours. And whereas obviously the British Crown Jewels are housed in the Tower of London, the Hungarian crown is found beneath that dome in the Hungarian Parliament. And the other difference is, whereas, as I said, both parliaments draw on Gothic tradition, the Hungarian Parliament manages to bring in Baroque architecture, architectural features also, and merge them harmoniously with the Gothic. And not only is the Hungarian Parliament ostentatious and monumentally resplendent, but it's also technically, or was technically, groundbreaking when it was built in 1902. It incorporated not only sophisticated central heating, but even air conditioning, which was entirely unheard of back in the turn of the last century. I also visited Halas-Bastia, which is the fisherman's bastion, and a great outlook post over the Blue Danube. It was also built in 1902, and the monument's located sort of on the top of the hill near Buda Castle. It blends, much like the Hungarian Parliament itself, a number of styles: Gothic revivalism, but also Romanesque revivalism, and there are definite undertones of Turkic and Mongol styles in there, which I suppose really reflect the uniquely sort of Hungarian Magyar Ugar architectural fusion. The next day I visited Széchenyi. It's one of the largest public bath houses complexes in Europe, and it dates back to 1913. Has about 20 halls indoor and outdoors, and endless steam rooms and saunas. It has a very grand feel, but also I felt it was quite institutional. It was quite sort of bureaucratic. It took me a lot of online paperwork simply to arrange a massage. It was certainly worth visiting. It's quite grand in its feel. The only thing there was that there was a sort of sulfuric methanol aroma permeating the whole complex, which I would imagine would be quite overwhelming to most people. I'm actually functionally anosmic. I don't really have a sense of smell at all, and yet even I was able to detect it. So I think to anybody else it would be quite overpowering. But going back to Budapest, Budapest is beautiful architecturally, and not only that, but it's undergoing a uplifting architectural revival with many previous communist architectural massacres, if you like, being stripped of their austere grey communist era exteriors and restored to a more traditional style. And then from Budapest I drove to Vienna, which I found to be very grand. Incidentally, if mounted emperor statues are your thing, do go to Vienna, because in central Vienna they're literally in every street corner. I visited the Schönbrunn Palace and a wonderful Christmas market outside the Schönbrunn Palace, where I picked up a couple of beautifully hand-painted Ukrainian Christmas decorations. The Schönbrunn Palace was the home of the Habsburgs, and right up until Franz Joseph as the last emperor in the 19th century, until the fall of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And its other big claim to fame, it was where Mozart first played for Emperor Joseph II in 1762, which featured in the famous film Amadeus. And 200 years after that, in 1961, where Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, met with President Kennedy for the Vienna summit. And there are many Mozart concerts held every day in Vienna to cater mellifluently to the endless crowds of tourists. The Musikverein, 18th century period costume Mozart concert is arguably the best, and the one I managed to get tickets for. And I strategically acquired a seat in the first row of the balcony, which was one of the best seats in the house. Not the most expensive, but one of the best in my view, because it gave a wonderful sort of bird's eye view, sort of looking down onto the stage. And the crowd-pleasing orchestra played all the favourites, from Marriage of Figaro and Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute, and operas, and it even managed to do some off-ex-program renditions of the Blue Danube and Radetzky March, which of course are Johann Strauss, which are not Mozart. So Vienna was great. The only thing I was somewhat disappointed with in Vienna was that there was only, despite having defeated the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Vienna in 1683, I was only able to find one rather small and rather plaque to the Polish King Jan Sobieski III, who was a very famous Polish king. And he essentially stopped the Ottoman Turks from taking over Europe in the 17th century. So the next day I got up uh, before dawn, very, very early, 4 a.m., in order to drive the 3.5 hours to the Austrian town of Hallstatt before all the tourists arrive. So Hallstatt is a very, very picturesque town on the banks of the Hallstatter Sea, this lake, which has a distinctive church with a high spire. And that's, you probably recognize it because it's a common desktop background photo. And there I took the funicular railway up to the Hallstatt Skywalk, the town, with views of the town and the lake below. And from there I drove to Salzburg through some very, very picturesque sort of Austrian countryside, through the Gestüt Pass and numerous valleys which had clearly seen snowstorms in the previous few days. And Salzburg had a sublimely elegant and very handsome Christmas market. I just found particularly stunning. The next day I drove up past Linz and across the border into Czechia. I stopped at Český Krumlov, which is a Czech town built on a bend of the Vltava river. The Vltava also flows through Prague. Český Krumlov is well worth visiting. It has a castle and very impressive viaduct-esque sort of bridge on one side of the castle, and it's sort of very sort of picture postcard. It somewhat reminded me of the Swiss city of Bern, the capital of Switzerland, in fact, which I visited last year, which is also built on a bend in the river and has a sort of similar medieval feel. So Český Krumlov derives from the German Krumme Au, which translates as crooked meadow, from the bend in the river, and Český was sort of added as a prefix in the 15th century in order to differentiate it from the town of Moravecký Krumlov in South Moravia. Now Bohemia and Moravia now are both part of Czechia. So then I drove on up to Prague. I found the countryside, by the way, all throughout most of the trip, Austria, Czechia, to be far less dense, certainly, than traveling around in southern England. And it felt always more like driving in Scotland, actually. So I drove to Prague, where I arrived after dark. Prague was a beautiful, fun, and exciting city. I found it was, although I can't speak Czech because my family is Polish. Polish is my third language. I found I did understand, or could guess very accurately at the meaning of many words, and they're so close to Polish. So I visited there all the tourist attractions: Wenceslas Square, Karlov Bridge, Charles Bridge, and of course the very famous astronomical clock. But no trip to Prague would be complete without paying a visit to Franz Kafka's place and museum. Kafka is obviously the novelist. I read most of his novels at 18. His writings, the most famous of which are Metamorphosis, The Trial, and The Castle, typically feature isolated protagonists facing bizarre or surrealist predicaments and incomprehensible socio-bureaucratic powers. So he examines the themes of alienation, existential anxiety, guilt, and absurdity, all of which I've actually quite familiar with and sort of can identify with. In fact, I use the word Kafkaesque frequently, because I've been on the receiving end of many Kafkaesque situations. From Prague, my next stop was Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia, called Pressburg or Prešpok in Slovak, when it was part of the Austrian Empire. Bratislava is a more modern nomenclature, which I believe comes from the name Bratislaus. And interestingly, Bratislava is only about 80 kilometers east of Vienna, so it's that Vienna and Bratislava are very close. both on the Danube, and indeed the Austrian border is very, very close to the western side of Bratislava. So the interesting of the Christmas market, I should say, in Bratislava was again beautiful, and particularly I found it exceptionally beautifully lit. The lighting was quite remarkable. Bratislava is a much smaller city than Vienna. Vienna is about 2 million, Prague 1.5 million. Bratislava is only sort of 500,000 or less, and so it had a sort of a smaller feel to it. And at Bratislava, I did the award-winning post-communist tour. I recommend, and for the post-communist tour, I was driven around in a 1970s Skoda car, and which was really, really cool. And we drove places around the city, including the nearby border, where those who were once trying to escape socialism were unfortunately shot at by border guards. And as a memorial to them, we went to Przejalka, which is the largest socialist era housing estate in Central Europe, where 25% of Bratislava's residents still live. We went to a Soviet memorial and the places where the Soviet leaders once lived, of course, in much better accommodation than the rest of the citizens, because some people are more equal than others under socialism. And that culminated my tour, but it was a wonderful tour. I finally on Christmas Eve on the 23rd, I drove from Bratislava back to Budapest through a snowstorm and blizzard, and I dropped off the car in Budapest and flew back to the UK. But I really enjoyed it, and I felt it was, as I say, unapologetically traditional, unapologetically Christian, and just a wonderful escape from an increasingly oppressive Western obsession with wokeism, with guilt of Europe's past, and there's one other thing I really liked about everywhere that I visited. When they serve you tea, it comes with honey, and that's just wonderful. That you don't get that in the UK, but I just thought that was a wonderful thing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this a little bit more fun and different Reasoned Heretic episode, and I hope to see you again for the next one. And Happy New Year for 2025.